What the government is doing is using the enforcement provisions of the of the Internal Revenue Code and the regulations that only apply to liquor, tobacco, and firearms. They're using that to extort income tax from the American public. As I just mentioned a little while ago, the income tax is only the tip of the iceberg. What we want to do is take back America from the politicians and the lawyers who are basically running it. And the average American is a slave. Well, I want to mention this. People don't know. The average American doesn't realize he's a slave. But if we have studied, he's worse than a slave, because we have studied the books of the old slave plantations down south, and 90% of the income of the income of those plantations went to support the slave population. Slaves had to be fed, they had to be clothed, they had to be housed. If they got sick, they were afraid of plagues. An average slave cost $800 then, which is like $8,000 today. They had to be isolated and nurtured back to health. Otherwise, you're going to infect all of your slaves. It's not a pitch for slavery, but slavery is very uneconomic because slaves don't work hard, because a hard-working slave is not going to get any money. So we know that slaves only gave up 10% of their productivity. Now serfs, all during the Middle Ages, who weren't slaves, but they were tied to the soil, and they had to give the lord of the manor 25% of what they produced. So slaves only gave up 10%. Serfs only gave up 25%, and Americans who think they're free give up 50%. The average American is nothing but an income-generating machine for the bureaucratic political complex. And what they do is, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who want something for nothing from the government. And what the government has been doing is promising people who want something for nothing and going to regular wage earners and taxing their labor. So there's two kinds of people who pay taxes and people who get subsidies. And if you're paying taxes, you're just being used. You're supporting another family who the government has promised 4 votes to get something for nothing. Because all politicians do, of course, is take money from this guy and give it to him. And that's all illegal, incidentally. Incidentally, it's all illegal. I'm going to tell you why. Because the government cannot tax you. The Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. There are only 3 things the federal government can tax us for. To pay the debts of the United States. They can't tax me to pay his debt, yet when you guarantee your mortgage and you can't pay it, I'm paying off your mortgage. Or suppose you get a student loan and you renege on it. Technically, I'm going to pay because you went to... So the government is taxing me to support him. How about we're still paying farmers, are getting tobacco subsidies for not growing a product which we're told we shouldn't even use anyway. They're
still getting subsidies for the REA.
Whatever. And how about when the government taxes us for the economic benefit of a foreign government? There's nothing in here that says the government can tax you. They're only for the general welfare of the United States. And it's the welfare of the United States, not the welfare of Tom, Dick, and Harry. In other words, when the government puts up a weather station or even puts up an embassy, it's for all Americans. Some Americans may use it more than others. But when the government taxes you and gives him a subsidy, he's taxing you for his benefit. Unconstitutional. And as a matter of fact, as long as I'm on it, if you want to see what the government actually does with your money, if you take a 1040 booklet, and in the back there's a pie chart. Everybody forgets to look at it. And if I were to say to you, how much money do you think the government spends? How much in taxes that it collects does it actually spend to run the government? That is all of the administrative agencies, all the foreign embassies, the FBI, the courts. What percentage of the federal budget do you think the government spends on running the government? You want to make a guess? 58%. Make a guess. Yeah. 2%. The government only spends 2% of what it collects to actually run the government. Now, 20% is used for the defense budget, for the Army, Navy, National Defense, and Veterans Affairs. Now, I was in Army finance, and I can tell you that the money that the Army wastes, and we ever heard about the $800 toilet seats, but that's probably at least 25% inflated. But if we take the defense budget and what the government spends on running it, it's only 20. So the government only spends 22% of what it collects running the government and on defense. Well, what are the other things the government spends money on? Well, 15% is now interest on the national debt. That shows you how irresponsible they were. With all the money they wasted, they borrowed money to waste, and now we pay interest on the money that they wasted. So 22% is spent on legitimate government activity, 15% on interest on the national debt because they wasted so much. Can you imagine if the average family paid 15% of their income on interest on money that they borrowed? How could the government tell us how to run our businesses if they were so irresponsible? That's 15% now of what they have to collect. It's just interest on the debt. And incidentally, today, the debt of the United States is greater than the collective debt of every other country in the world. That's how big our debt is. And when the government reports the debt, it's $5 trillion. That's only the funded debt. That doesn't include unfunded Social Security obligations, unfunded veterans' pensions, unfunded retirement benefits, which are probably twice as great as the funded debt. So if you took the government's funded and unfunded obligations, it's probably 15 trillion, which is probably greater than all of the above-ground wealth of the entire stock market is worth about $7 trillion. And all of the above-ground wealth is reported at, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 trillion. The government has put us into hock greater than all of our above-ground wealth. And anyway, now...
They were so concerned about the children.
Yeah, well, anyway, all the rest are 60%. The balance, let me go over this again. 2% to run the government, 20% to run the Army and Navy, 15% to service our debt. All the rest are better than 60%, are nothing more but transfer payments, where the government literally taking money from you and giving it to somebody else, whether you call it Medicare, whether you call it Social Security. See, they give nice names for social programs, Social Security, Medicare, you know, and physical human development. None of these things, of course, are authorized by the Constitution. Just to give you an idea, in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, the government is authorized to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Incidentally, the Constitution was designed to limit the government's power. Thomas Jefferson, 200 years ago, said, let us bind up government in the chains of the Constitution. But who's binding them up? Now, here's what the Constitution says. The government is authorized to borrow money. Is there any provision here for the government to lend money or guarantee debt? No. So when the government borrows and guarantees debt, they're making you a guarantor. They're making you the guarantor. There is no provision in the Constitution for the government to guarantee debt, and they do it and get away with it because nobody is enforcing the Constitution on the government.